The biscuit tin was cold in Violet Ford's hands, and the moment she pried the lid free and saw what was inside, every assumption she had ever made about Silas Mercer came apart like wet paper in a storm. She had not meant to go looking for anything. She had come into the bunkhouse at the Double Creek Ranch only because the wind had kicked up something fierce out of the northwest. And old Hank Prout had asked her to bring the hands their noon meal since the cook's boy had twisted his ankle running between the barn and the house. She had carried the pot of beans and the basket of cornbread across the yard with her skirt snapping at her ankles, and the wind had pushed the bunkhouse door shut behind her so hard that the latch bit and would not open again without a proper yank. She had set the pot down on the long plank table and moved through the narrow row between bunks to reach the door at the far end, and that was when she had caught her boot on the edge of something, a flat rectangular shape sitting just beneath the low frame of the end bunk, pushed back almost out of sight. It was a tobacco tin at first glance, or perhaps a tin for crackers. But when she crouched to shove it back beneath the bunk so that no one would trip on it, her fingers found the seam of the lid, and the tin shifted in a way that told her it was not empty. She did not know whose bunk it was. She told herself later that she would have put it back regardless. But the lid came free before she had fully decided anything, and then she was looking at letters. Dozens of them, folded and refolded until the creases were soft as cloth, tied in bundles with thin strips of cord, stacked with a care that bordered on reverence. The envelopes were worn at the corners, and the handwriting on them was her own. She recognized it before she recognized the situation. The letters were hers, every single one of them, written across 3 years of her life. The letters she had sent from Abilene, from Dodge City, from the little town of Harrow Creek, where she had stayed with her aunt the summer her father died. She had written them without much expectation, because that was what you did when you were lonely, and you had known someone once who made the loneliness feel smaller. She had written them to Silas Mercer, and she had told herself each time that she was not certain he read them, let alone kept them. She had told herself she was foolish for writing. She had nearly stopped a dozen times. She had not stopped, and he had kept every one. She was still crouched on the dirt floor of the bunkhouse, the tin balanced on her knees, when the door at the far end opened and Silas walked in. He stopped in the doorframe with the November light behind him and the cold air coming in around his shoulders, and for a moment he said nothing at all. He was 26 years old and lean in the way that men got from working cattle through hard seasons, with dark hair that needed cutting and eyes that were a particular shade of brown that Violet had spent 3 years trying not to think about too carefully. He had dust on his coat and his hat in his hand, and he looked at her the way a man looks when he has been caught at something enormous. Violet looked down at the tin in her hands, then back up at him. She did not say she was sorry. He did not say anything at all for a long time. "I did not know you were in here," he said finally. "I brought the noon meal," she said. "The latch on the other door stuck." He nodded once, slowly. He made no move to come forward and take the tin from her. He made no move to explain or deflect or laugh it off the way some men might have done. He just stood there in the door with the wind at his back and watched her hold the evidence of something she had not known she was looking for. "These are mine," she said, though it was not a question. "Yes," he said. "You kept all of them." "Yes." She looked down at the bundles again. Her fingers touched the topmost envelope and she felt the softness of it, the way the paper had gone almost silky from handling. He had read these. He had read them more than once, possibly more than she could count, because paper only got that soft from hands. "Why did you never write back?" she asked. It was the most important question she had, and she asked it quietly because the bunkhouse was small and the wind was loud outside, and she did not want to shout something like that across the space between them. Silas stepped inside and pulled the far door closed behind him. He hung his hat on the peg beside the door and ran a hand through his hair, and then he crossed the bunkhouse and sat down on the edge of the bunk, his bunk. She understood now, and rested his elbows on his knees. He looked at the floor for a moment. "I tried," he said. "I wrote a dozen letters and none of them said the right thing." "What was the right thing?" He looked up at her then, and the look on his face was not complicated. It was actually very simple, and that was what made it so difficult to look at directly. "That I wanted you to come back," he said. Violet Ford was 24 years old, and she had spent the better part of those years being practical about what she wanted and realistic about what she could have. She had grown up in a Kansas territory that did not have much patience for dreaming, with a father who worked hard and died young and a mother who had died younger. And she had learned early that the world did not arrange itself into the shapes you hoped for. She had learned to want things quietly and to be prepared for those wants to come to nothing. She had not been prepared for this. She set the tin down carefully on the floor between her boots. She did not close the lid. "You should have said that," she told him. "I know it. 3 years, Silas." "I know it," he said again, and the weight in those 3 words was considerable. The wind found a gap somewhere in the bunkhouse walls and moved through it with a thin, cold sound. Outside, the cattle at the eastern pasture fence were making noise, and somewhere across the yard someone was hammering at something that needed mending. The world at the Double Creek Ranch was carrying on exactly as it always did, indifferent to what was happening in the narrow space between 2 people. Violet Ford looked at Silas Mercer and thought about 3 years of letters written in lamplight, of the ink drying on words she had chosen carefully and then dismissed as insufficient, and then sent anyway because silence seemed worse. She thought about the way she had felt every time she sealed an envelope, the combination of hope and preemptive defeat that she had come to think of as simply her particular relationship with wanting. "Say it now, then," she said. Silas looked at her steadily. "I want you to stay. I have wanted that since the summer you left Harrow Creek, and I couldn't make myself say it before you got on the stage. Why didn't you?" "Because I had nothing then. No land, no money, no particular prospects. I was a hand on someone else's ranch, and you were the schoolteacher's niece, and you had places to go. I didn't have anywhere to go," she said. "I was just going. I didn't know that. You didn't ask." He nodded slowly. "I didn't ask." She thought about all the distances she had covered since that summer in Harrow Creek. Abilene, where she had worked in a dry goods store for 8 months and written to Silas because there was no one else she particularly wanted to talk to. Dodge City, which she had not liked, and where she had written to him about not liking it. The months at her aunt's house after her father passed. And then 2 months ago, Harrow Creek again because her aunt had gotten older and needed help, and because, though she had not admitted this to herself clearly, it put her in the same general territory as the Double Creek Ranch, where Silas Mercer worked, where she now stood with his secret in a tin at her feet. "I am not leaving again," she said. Something shifted in his face. Not dramatic, not sudden, it was more like a lock giving way after a long time of pressure. "Is that on account of your aunt?" "Partly," she said. He waited. "And partly not," she said. He stood up then, and it was only 2 steps across the narrow aisle between bunks, and he stopped in front of her at a distance that was close but not presumptuous, and looked at her with those brown eyes that she had spent 3 years trying to describe to herself in letters she had never sent to anyone. "Violet," he said. "Don't make a speech," she told him. "You are not good at speeches." "I know it." "Just—" She picked up the tin and held it out toward him. He took it, but he held her hands along with it, the tin between their palms, warm now from her grip. His hands were rough and dry and very certain, and she thought that was something she had always known about him, that certainty, even when it operated at a frustrating remove. "I kept everyone," he said, unnecessarily. "I know," she said. "I can see that." He did not let go of her hands. She did not ask him to. That was how it started. Or rather, that was how the thing that had already started 3 years ago on a summer afternoon in Harrow Creek finally admitted to itself what it was. The town of Harrow Creek sat in a shallow valley between 2 limestone ridges in southwestern Kansas, which in the year 1878 was still a place in the ongoing process of becoming itself. The cattle drives had moved through and left their marks in the form of worn trails and the occasional painted saloon sign, and the railroad had come close enough to matter, threading through a larger town 12 miles east called Keller's Bend. Harrow Creek was the kind of town that appeared on some maps and was absent from others, with a main street of packed earth and 6 or 7 buildings of consequence and a scattering of homesteads in the surrounding land. The Double Creek Ranch belonged to a man named August Hollies, who was 53 years old and had built the operation over 2 decades from a single section of land to something respectable. He ran 600 head of cattle and employed 9 men year-round, with more during the drives. He was not a generous man in the way that some ranchers were, but he was fair, which counted for more in practical terms, and Silas had worked for him for 4 years and earned a small but real degree of trust. Violet's aunt was a woman named Ruth Hartwell, who had come to Harrow Creek with her late husband 20 years ago and stayed on after he died because she had put too much work into the house and the garden to start over somewhere else. She was 60 years old and walked with a cane and had opinions about nearly everything, which she expressed with a precision that Violet found both exhausting and admirable. Ruth had written to Violet in September to say that her hip was giving her serious trouble and she could use some help through the winter, and Violet had arrived in October with 2 trunks and a careful arrangement of practical intentions. She had not announced herself to Silas. She had thought, and this was the thinking of a person who has spent years protecting themselves from wanting things too openly, that she would simply be nearby for a while, that she would see if any particular feeling survived proximity and the ordinary texture of daily life, that she would be sensible about the whole thing. She had not anticipated the biscuit tin. In the days after she found it, she and Silas began the careful process of building something new from the materials they had been keeping for each other without knowing it. It was not simple, because it never is, and it was not quick, because they were both people who had learned not to rush toward things that mattered. He came to call on Sunday afternoon, which was the one afternoon August Hollies gave his hands free. He came to the Hartwell house on the edge of town with his hat clean and his coat brushed, and a handful of late-season wildflowers that he had clearly found along the creek, because they were slightly bedraggled, and that was the most touching thing about them. Aunt Ruth received him at the door with the particular expression she reserved for situations she found interesting and would not say so, and she made him tea and left them in the sitting room, and then went conspicuously to the other end of the house, where the sound of her cane on the floor told them exactly where she was. "You look better when you've had a chance to wash your face," Violet told him. He laughed, which was something she had not heard enough of in her life. Silas Mercer had a laugh that arrived slowly and then was completely genuine, with nothing held back from it. "You look exactly the same," he said. 3 years and I look the same. "You look like yourself," he said. "That doesn't change." They talked for 2 hours about things that mattered and things that did not, and somewhere in the middle of all of it Violet understood that this was what she had been doing in all those letters, practicing for this. Learning what she wanted to say to him by actually saying it, even when he had not replied. She had built the conversation over 3 years, and now it was happening in real time, and she found that she was not nervous so much as entirely alert, present in a way she had not been in some time. He told her about the years she had been gone, or the shape of them. He had come to Double Creek from a ranch in the Texas Panhandle, following better wages and a better situation. He had worked hard and saved what he could. August Hollies had begun to trust him with more responsibility, and there had been careful, practical talk about whether Silas might be interested in taking on a small piece of the ranch's management, with some form of stake in the land to follow if things worked out. "Is that what you want?" she asked. "To stay here and build something on this land?" "It is," he said. "I've been clear on that for a while." Even before, she made a gesture that indicated the biscuit tin without saying it. "Even before," he said, "though the before and the now are not unconnected." She looked at him over her teacup. "Meaning?" He leaned forward slightly with his elbows on his knees, which she had noticed was a habit of his when he was about to say something he had thought about. Meaning that knowing you were out there, writing to me, it mattered to what I was building toward. I may not have said so. I may have been a fool about saying so. But it mattered. The sitting room was warm and smelled of the dried herbs that Ruth kept in bunches from the ceiling, and the light through the west window was the amber light of a November afternoon in Kansas. Violet thought about what it meant to have mattered to someone's life without knowing it, to have been present in a way you could not see. She found that she was not angry about the silence exactly. She had been perhaps for a day or two, but the anger had moved through her and left something quieter in its place. "Tell me about the panhandle," she said. "Tell me about before you came here." And he did, and she learned things she had not known, that he had grown up on the edge of the staked plains, in a family of modest means with 3 brothers and a father who worked cattle and a mother who had died when Silas was 12. That the years after that had been years of work and movement, learning the trade from the ground up, moving from outfit to outfit the way young men did in that era, building skills without building roots. That he had come to Harrow Creek 4 years ago with enough experience to be useful and enough restlessness to be looking for something, though he had not been entirely certain what. "And now?" she asked. He looked at her steadily. "Now I have a better idea." She felt the warmth in her chest that she had always associated with his letters, or rather, with her own letters, with the act of thinking about him carefully enough to write things down. It was not a giddy feeling. It was something more serious and more sustainable than that, something that felt less like excitement and more like orientation. She knew which direction to point herself, was what it felt like. December came to Harrow Creek with its particular severity, and Violet settled into the rhythm of caring for her aunt and the attendant rhythm of Sunday afternoons with Silas. The town absorbed her gradually, the way small towns do by accumulation of small recognitions, the feed store owner learning her name, the women at the church quilting circle acknowledging her contributions with increasing warmth. She helped Ruth with the household accounts and with correspondence, and with the management of the garden beds, which in December meant laying straw over what needed protecting until spring. Silas came on Sundays and sometimes on weekday evenings if the work allowed it, which in December meant less often than either of them would have preferred. He was helping August Hollies through the winter feed situation, which was complicated by a dry autumn that had left the pastures less productive than expected, and by the purchase of some additional cattle that needed processing and recording before the year turned. He worked long days in the cold and came to the Hartwell house looking tired in the specific way that hard outdoor work produced bone tired, the kind that was actually satisfying. Ruth liked him, which Violet had suspected, and which was confirmed over the course of several Sunday teas. Ruth was not a woman who expressed approval easily, and her liking for Silas took the form of asking him difficult questions about his plans and opinions and history, which he answered with the directness she clearly found respectable. She told Violet privately one evening, while they were washing the supper dishes by lamplight, that Silas Mercer was a man who kept his word. "How do you know?" Violet asked. "You've known him for a month." "I know by the way he talks about August Hollies," Ruth said. "He doesn't complain, and he doesn't flatter either. He just says what's so. That's how you know a man keeps his word. He also keeps his observations honest." Violet thought about the biscuit tin. She thought about years of keeping something safe and secret without being asked to, without any guarantee that it would ever matter to anyone. She thought that was probably also a form of keeping your word. She wrote him a letter on the 17th of December, which she knew was somewhat absurd given that she saw him twice a week. But there were things that were easier to say in writing, and she had learned that about herself across 3 years of practice. She wrote it on the good stationery that Ruth kept in the desk in the sitting room, with the small flowers printed in the corner, and she folded it and put it in an envelope, and gave it to him the following Sunday without comment. He read it at the table while she pretended to look out the window, and when he finished, he folded it along its original creases and put it in his coat pocket. He did not say anything for a moment. "Am I going to find this in a tin someday?" she asked. "Yes," he said simply. She looked out the window at the winter street where a horse was tied to the rail in front of the general store, and a boy was sweeping the porch of the hotel, and she allowed herself to feel the full, uncomplicated warmth of what that meant. On Christmas Eve, there was a gathering at the church, the kind of modest winter celebration that small frontier towns organized as much for warmth and company as for any other reason. Violet went with Ruth and found that half of Harrow Creek was already inside, packed between the pews with their best clothes on and their breath fogging slightly in the air that even the wood stove could not fully warm. The preacher, a lean man named Hatch who had been in Harrow Creek for 5 years, and had the mended, practical quality of a man who understood his particular flock, led them through the carols with more enthusiasm than accuracy. Silas arrived late with several of the other Double Creek hands, having come in from a day of work that had not respected the calendar. He slipped into the pew beside Violet, and she felt the cold coming off his coat and thought, privately and with some pleasure, that this was now a familiar thing, his specific cold, his specific presence beside her. After the service, people gathered in the small adjacent hall where the ladies of the congregation had laid out a table of food, and Violet stood with a cup of cider and watched the town arrange itself in its winter patterns. She saw August Holly speaking with the bank man whose name was Delmont, a heavy-set, quiet man who everyone was generally polite to and nobody particularly liked. She saw the feed store owner's wife scolding her son with the resigned efficiency of someone who had done this many times. She saw Ruth, seated with other older women near the stove, holding court in the way that older women of her type held court by saying little but saying it exactly. Silas appeared at her elbow with a plate of cookies that someone's wife had made. "You look like you're cataloging people," he said. "I am," she said. "It's a habit." "Write about it, probably." He looked out at the room with her. "I wrote you one letter," he said. "In the winter of '76, I got as far as 2 paragraphs. What did they say?" "The first one said I was well and that the winter had been hard, very gripping material," she laughed. "And the second," he was quiet for a moment, "the second said that I read your last letter enough times that I had memorized the parts that mattered and that I didn't know what to do with that." He paused. "I thought that was too much to say. It wasn't too much. I know that now." She looked at him in the warm light of the church hall, with the noise of Harrow Creek's Christmas gathering around them, and thought that this was possibly the most important conversation she had ever had in a public setting, which was the way the most important conversations often worked. "Do not write me any more letters that you do not send," she told him. "Whatever you are thinking, say it, even if it's a great deal. Especially if it's a great deal." He nodded once, and then he said, quietly and without preface, "I am in love with you, Violet. I have been for 3 years and possibly longer, and I should have told you in Harrow Creek the first time in the summer of '75 when you were reading on your aunt's porch and you looked up at me over the book and I thought, there she is. That's the woman I want to spend my life with." And then I thought a great many practical thoughts, and none of them led me to say that out loud, and I have regretted it since. The noise of the room around them went distant and particular, the way sounds do when attention is entirely engaged elsewhere. Violet looked at him and understood that he had kept this as he had kept the letters carefully, without promise of return, simply because it was true and true things deserved to be preserved. "The summer of '75, she said. "Yes. I was reading Cooper," she said. "The Deerslayer. I remember because I was at the part I didn't like and I was glad of the interruption." Something lit in his face. "You were glad?" "Exceedingly." He was not a man who smiled quickly, as she had established, but when he smiled it was the complete thing, nothing held in reserve. He smiled now. "What were you thinking?" she asked. "When you looked at me?" "I told you, tell me again, that you were the woman I wanted to spend my life with," he said. "That hasn't changed." Violet Ford stood in the warm light of the church hall with a cup of cider in her hand and Silas Mercer beside her, and thought that the winter of 1878 turning toward 1879 was, in its way, the most consequential winter of her life. She thought about all the miles between all the places she had been, and how they had always somehow oriented toward Harrow Creek, toward Ruth's house with the dried herbs from the ceiling, toward a man who kept things carefully and said the important things late but truly. "I have been in love with you since approximately the second letter I wrote you," she told him. "The one from Abilene where I described the argument between the store owner and the man who thought he had been short-changed on flour. I was writing to you about it because I wanted to make you laugh, and that was when I understood." "I laughed at that letter," he said. "Good," she said. "It was a funny argument." He took her free hand then, there in the church hall, with the people of Harrow Creek all around them, and held it simply and without drama, and Violet thought that 3 years of letters had been, in their way, a very thorough courtship. They had simply been conducting it at a distance, across paper and seasons and the particular Kansas sky. January arrived with a blizzard that kept everyone close to their stoves for a week, and then it relented into cold sunshine, and the world went on. Silas continued his work at Double Creek with the added dimension of what August Hollies had been hinting at, the possibility of a more permanent arrangement. In late January, August called Silas into the main house, which was a frame structure of 8 rooms that August occupied alone since his wife had gone back east to care for her aging mother 3 years prior, and had then, as sometimes happened, not come back. Silas told Violet about it on the following Sunday, sitting in the kitchen of the Hartwell house where Ruth had left them with a pot of coffee and gone to rest. August Hollies had proposed something specific: a small parcel of land, 40 acres at the north edge of the Double Creek property, adjacent to the creek itself. It was good land, partially wooded, with water rights. Silas could have it at a price that was fair and that could be paid over time against his wages, with certain conditions attached to the arrangement, conditions that had primarily to do with the expectation that Silas would remain as Double Creek's foreman for a minimum of 5 years and continue to manage certain of the operation's functions. "He's offering you your own land," Violet said, "in a manner of speaking, with conditions. What do you think of the conditions?" Silas wrapped his hands around his coffee cup and looked at it. "I think they're fair. I think he's a man who makes fair deals, and this is a fair deal. The land is good. Have you seen it? I've worked it. It's north pasture, or part of it. There's a stand of cottonwoods along the creek and the soil is good. You could build something there." Violet was quiet for a moment. "What kind of something?" He looked at her across the table. "The kind with a house in it." She held his gaze. "Silas Mercer," she said. "I am saying it out loud," he said, "as instructed. You are doing well. I want to build something there with you," he said, "if that is something you want. I know I am a man asking you to take on a considerable amount of uncertain work in an uncertain place, with not much to show yet beyond some letters in a tin, and a piece of land I don't fully own. But I want to ask." Violet looked at the kitchen around her, Ruth's kitchen, with the pot on the iron stove and the curtains that Ruth had made herself and the smell of coffee and wood smoke that she had come to associate with safety and quiet. She thought about Abilene and Dodge City and all the places she had been that were not exactly home. She thought about the 40 acres along the creek and what might be built there. "Ask me properly then," she said. He set his coffee cup down and looked at her with an expression that was both completely serious and lit from within by something that she recognized, because she felt it herself. "Will you marry me, Violet?" "Yes," she said. "Obviously yes." "I wrote you 17 letters over 3 years, Silas. There was never going to be another answer." He laughed, and it was the full version of his laugh, the genuine one with nothing held back. She laughed too, and then he reached across the table and took both her hands and held them. And outside the window the January sun was on the snow and the light was extraordinary, the kind that only exists in deep winter and is all the more beautiful for being cold. They told Ruth that same afternoon. Ruth received the news with the expression of someone who had been expecting it for some time, and found the confirmation satisfying rather than surprising. She said that she thought Silas was a reasonable man, and that Violet had always needed someone reasonable. And then she said that she supposed there would be a great deal of organizing to do, and began immediately to organize it. The announcement traveled through Harrow Creek at the speed such announcements traveled through small frontier towns, which was considerable. By the following Tuesday, Violet had been congratulated by the feed store owner, the minister's wife, and a woman named Clara Briggs who worked at the hotel and who Violet barely knew, which suggested the news had moved freely. She did not mind it. There was something pleasant about being absorbed into the known life of a place, about being a part of the story the town was telling about itself. Silas, for his part, received congratulations from August Hollies with the solemnity of a man who had been expecting it, and from the other hands at Double Creek with considerably more noise. There was a general sentiment among the hands that Silas had been a confirmed bachelor, and that something remarkable must have occurred, and the discovery of that something being Violet Ford produced a variety of responses ranging from admiring to ribald, most of which Silas bore with the equanimity of a man who was extremely pleased with his situation, and therefore could not be bothered by the commentary. The wedding was set for March, not a fashionable month for weddings in any calculation, but a practical one given that the blizzard season would be largely past and the drives had not yet started, which meant Silas's time would be his own for a few days. Ruth threw herself into the preparations with an energy that belied her hip and her cane, writing letters to a dressmaker in Keller's Bend, and consulting with the preacher about the order of the ceremony and making lists of things that needed doing, which Violet found and added to, and which Ruth then amended and reorganized. "You do not have to do all of this," Violet told her one evening. "I know I do not have to," Ruth said. "I want to. You are the only family I have left, Violet, and I intend to make something proper of your wedding." Violet sat down beside her aunt at the kitchen table and put her arm around those angular, capable shoulders. Ruth had not been an easy woman to grow up around. She had not been soft, and she had not pretended that the world was gentler than it was, and there had been periods of Violet's childhood when she had found her aunt's precision more frightening than comforting. But she had grown into it. She had learned to value the honesty of it. Ruth Hartwell had told her the truth about difficult things, including the death of her father, with a directness that had initially seemed cold and had ultimately been a kindness. "I know," Violet said. "Thank you." Ruth patted her hand with the efficiency of a woman who found too much sentiment uncomfortable and then returned to her list. February moved through its paces and then March came, cold and tentative at first, with the creek still running with snowmelt and the pastures going from brown to a grudging early green. The wedding was on the 14th, a Thursday, because that was when the preacher had no other obligations and Silas had arranged his days with August Hollies accordingly. The church in Harrow Creek was not large, but it did not need to be. What it needed to hold was the people who mattered, and those fit inside it with room. Ruth sat in the front row in her good black dress and her finest cameo brooch, upright as a telegraph pole despite her hip. August Hollies came, and several of the Double Creek hands, including old Hank Prout, who had inadvertently set everything in motion by asking Violet to bring the noon meal. The preacher Hatch stood at the front with the particular solemnity of his office. Violet wore the dress that Ruth had commissioned from the Keller's Bend dressmaker, a practical, beautiful thing in a deep blue wool that the dressmaker had sent along with the observation that blue suited a woman with Violet's coloring, which was true. She carried the small bunch of early spring flowers that Clara Briggs from the hotel had pressed into her hands that morning with more warmth than Violet had expected, and she walked up the aisle of the Harrow Creek church with Ruth's hand on her arm and looked at Silas waiting at the front. He was wearing his good clothes and he looked slightly uncomfortable in the collar, which was something she found endearing, and he was looking at her in the way he had looked at her from the first, with that particular attention that made her feel both seen and safe. She thought of the biscuit tin. She thought of all the letters inside it, worn soft from handling. She thought of 3 years of sentences written in lamplight and sent across Kansas and kept more carefully than she had known. She thought all of it led here. The ceremony was honest and brief, the way frontier ceremonies often were, not for lack of meaning but for recognition that the meaning was in the substance, not the surrounding architecture. They exchanged what they had, their word, their intention, their future. Preacher Hatch pronounced them married, and the church made the sound that small gathered communities make when something real has been witnessed. Silas kissed her with a restraint that she found somewhat typical, and the gathered hands of Double Creek found hilarious, and she laughed against his mouth, and then the day opened up around them. The celebration afterward was at August Hollis's main house, where the cook had been preparing for 2 days, and where several tables had been moved outside into the March afternoon, which was cold enough for coats but clear and blue-skied in a way that felt like a gift. There was food and there was some whiskey, carefully moderated because Preacher Hatch had strong feelings on the subject. And there was music from a fiddle played by one of the hands named Cord, who turned out to be considerably better at it than anyone had expected. Silas danced with her on the packed dirt of the ranch yard with the fiddle going and the cold air on their faces, and she thought that this was something she would remember for the rest of her life. The particular quality of this afternoon, the smell of the turned earth and the livestock and the coffee someone had put over the fire outside, and Silas's hand at her back and the look on his face when he looked at her. Happy? He asked. Completely, she said. I do not have words for it, he said, and I've had some practice with words. You have had some practice with keeping words, she said. That's slightly different. I'll work on it. She put her hand against his jaw. You are already doing very well. August Hollis gave them a week, which in ranching terms was generous, and they spent it at the Hartwell house while the first phases of work began on the land to the north. Silas had engaged 2 of his brothers from Texas, who turned out to be real and present people when she finally met them, both dark-haired like Silas, and both with the same particular quality of directness, to come up and help with the building. And they arrived 2 days after the wedding with a wagon of lumber and a great deal of energy. The cabin that went up on the 40 acres along the North Creek was not elaborate. It did not need to be, not yet. It was 2 rooms and a loft and a proper stone fireplace that Silas laid himself over the course of several evenings, carrying the stones from the creek in a borrowed cart. The windows were small and the floor was packed earth to begin with, though they covered it with planks before the summer was out. The door faced east so that the morning light came in first, which was Violet's particular request. She moved into the unfinished cabin in late March while it was still cold, because Ruth's house was Ruth's house and this one was theirs, and she found that she did not mind the unfinished parts. She swept the dirt floor and hung the curtains she had sewn from cotton that came in on the weekly wagon from Keller's Bend, and she set out the few things she had brought from her travels, the books that were the most persistent feature of her possessions, the small items her mother had left her, the good stationery with the flowers in the corner. The biscuit tin she put on the shelf that Silas built beside the fireplace, in a place of visibility. He noticed it there the evening he came home from a long day to find the cabin warmer than he'd left it and the smell of something cooking on the small iron stove. You put it up, he said. I did, she said. Any reason in particular? She looked at it on the shelf, a plain tin that had become something entirely other than what it appeared to be. I think it belongs somewhere people can see it, she said. I think it should not be hidden anymore. He came and stood behind her and looked at it over her shoulder, and she felt his hand come up to rest on her shoulder. All right, he said. Don't all right me about it, she said. Tell me what you think. He was quiet for a moment. I think that it represents a period of time when I was foolish about the right things. And I think it also represents something I am proud of, that I kept faith with something even when I wasn't sure it would ever come to anything. She turned around to face him. That is a very good answer. I told you I was working on it. Spring came in full. the kind that made the Kansas land reveal its better self, the grasses going green and the cottonwoods along the creek putting out their new leaves, pale and trembling. The creek ran clear and cold with snowmelt, and the pastures spread out in every direction with the particular openness that was one of the defining features of this landscape. Violet had spent time in several places, and she had not always been sure about this one. It was large in a way that required something from you, that demanded you be the thing that made the horizon meaningful. She found that she was equal to it. She began working, in the way that women on the frontier worked, not in the abstract or the theoretical, but in the daily and specific. She kept a kitchen garden in the plot south of the cabin, learning by doing what Ruth had tried to teach her over the years, and Ruth came out on some Sundays in the buggy to supervise and correct, which Violet accepted with the patience of a student who knows the teacher is usually right. She kept the house and managed the accounts for the small household, and she maintained her correspondence with care letters to friends in Abilene and Dodge City, and the occasional piece of writing that she sent to a small paper in Keller's Bend, whose editor turned out to be a man who appreciated a well-constructed sentence. The editor's name was Mortimer Webb, and he was 35 years old and serious about his newspaper in the way of a man who had found his exact calling. He published 3 of Violet's pieces in the spring of 1879, descriptions of life in the Creek Valley, observations about the changing seasons, a piece about the cattle drives as seen from a ranch adjacent, and paid her a modest sum that she told Silas about with considerable pride. Silas read the pieces with the attention he gave things he took seriously. He read them at the kitchen table in the evening, and Violet watched him and tried not to appear to be watching him, and when he finished he set the paper down and said, "These are very good. You are not required to say that. I know it. They are good, Violet. You can see things and put them down in a way that makes other people see them too. That's not a common ability." She felt the particular pleasure of being known accurately by someone who mattered. "Thank you," she said. "Will you keep writing for him, if he keeps printing me? He'd be a fool not to." She kept writing for Mortimer Webb, and he kept printing her, and by the fall of 1879 she had a small reputation in the county as a writer whose work was worth reading, which was something she had not entirely expected, and which pleased her more than she had expected it would. Silas, meanwhile, was building the life he had described. The foreman's work suited him, not because it was easy, it was not, but because it used his specific abilities, his aptitude for seeing the full picture of an operation and understanding where things needed attention. August Hollies, who had not trusted anyone with much for most of his working life, trusted Silas with more as the months passed, and the relationship between them developed into something mutually valuable in the way of 2 men who understood what the other was worth. The land along the North Creek was theirs, officially and on paper, in the fall of 1879. The deed filed in Keller's Bend with the county recorder in a transaction that August Hollies attended as witness. Silas came home with the paper folded in his coat pocket and put it in Violet's hand when she came to the door, and she unfolded it and read it and then looked up at him. "It's real," he said. "I can read, Silas. I know it. I just wanted to say it." She folded the deed carefully and put it in the desk that now stood in the corner of the main room, a piece of furniture she had found at an estate sale in Keller's Bend, and transported home in August Hollies' wagon with August's amused permission. "Our land," she said. "Our land," he agreed. It was the fall of 1879, and Violet knew she was expecting their first child, and she had not yet said so. She had been carrying the knowledge for several weeks, turning it over in the way you turn something beautiful and fragile to see all its faces. She told him on a Sunday evening in October while they were sitting on the step of the cabin watching the last of the sunset go out of the western sky, which was a thing they had developed a habit of doing in the good weather. She simply said it. "I am going to have a child. Our child. I expect it will be early in the new year." He turned to look at her and she watched his face move through the sequence: surprise, understanding, something that she could only call wonder, and then he put his arm around her and held her against his side and said nothing for a moment. "January or February?" he asked. "If I'm counting right, February." He was quiet again. Then, "Are you well?" "I am perfectly well," she said. "I am not made of glass." "I know it." "Then don't start acting like I am." "I'll try," he said, and she felt the smile in it rather than seeing it because she was looking at the fading western sky. "Are you happy?" she asked. "There are not enough words," he said. "I've already told you that." Ruth received the news with uncomplicated delight, which was one of the few subjects she was uncomplicated about. She arrived at the cabin the following Tuesday with a basket of things she considered necessary: tinctures and good wool, and a book about the management of early motherhood that she had obtained from some occasion she did not specify. And she sat in the kitchen and told Violet everything she knew about childbearing, which was considerable, and made Violet promise to fetch her immediately when the time came. Winter settled over the valley again, the second winter of their marriage, and Violet found that she loved it more this time because she knew what it was now. She knew the sound of the wind in the cottonwoods, and the way the ice formed along the edges of the creek, and the particular quality of the morning light on snow. She knew Silas's habits in winter: the early rising, the long days with the cattle, the evenings by the fire with the accounts, or the occasional novel that Violet brought home from the lending library situation that had developed informally at the general store. She knew that he drank his coffee dark, and that he slept solidly through weather that kept her awake, and that he always knew where she was in the cabin before she spoke, some awareness of her presence that was not supernatural but felt adjacent to it. She wrote about winter in the valley for Mortimer Webb's paper, and people in the county read it and told her it was exactly right. She wrote about the cattle and the cold, and the way the men at Double Creek moved through a blizzard with a practiced competence that was its own form of beauty. And she wrote about the creek at night when the ice cracked, and the sound traveled across the frozen pastures like something alive. She wrote, in a letter to a friend in Abilene, that she had found the place where she was meant to be. That it had taken some mileage and 3 years of letters that probably should have been said out loud, but that she had found it, and it was exactly where she had left it. The baby was born on the 4th of February, 1880, in the cabin on the North Creek, with Ruth in attendance and a woman from town named Pearl Sutton who had midwife experience. It was a hard night, but not the hardest that anyone in that room had known. And when it was over, Violet was exhausted and clear-eyed, and holding a boy who had Silas's dark hair and his mother's expressive face, and an extraordinary set of lungs. Silas had been outside in the cold for most of the night, which was the custom, pacing the area between the cabin and the creek with the patient persistence of a man doing the only thing available to him. He came inside when Pearl Sutton opened the door and told him it was done, and he stood in the doorway of the bedroom, the room that had been the second of the original 2 rooms and had been made into a bedroom when the cabin was extended in the fall, with an expression on his face that Violet filed carefully in her memory for permanent keeping. She held the baby out toward him. He crossed the room and took his son with the care of a man handling something irreplaceable and stood with him for a long moment. "He's strong," Pearl Sutton said from the doorway. "He had better be," Ruth said from the chair in the corner with the satisfaction of someone whose organizational efforts have produced the expected result. "What do we name him?" Violet asked. Silas looked at her over the baby's head. "I had a thought," he said. "Say it." "Thomas, for your father." She looked at him and felt the specific quality of being known by someone who pays attention, who remembers what you have said in letters across 3 years and in conversation across 2, who carries the important things the same way he carried the letters. "Thomas," she said. "Yes." Thomas Mercer opened his eyes and appeared to find the lamplight somewhat objectionable, and everyone in the room laughed, and the winter night outside carried on without them. Spring came again, and Thomas grew through it at the remarkable pace of new children. changing week by week in ways that astonished Violet, even though she understood it was the expected progression. He was a solid, cheerful child with opinions about everything, expressed through a variety of sounds that were clearly meaningful and becoming more so. He sat up in early summer and grabbed at everything within reach with a determination that Silas found particularly entertaining. "He's going to be trouble," Hank Prout observed, visiting on a Sunday in July when Thomas was 5 months old and engaged in the enterprise of trying to eat Hank's hat brim. "Every worthwhile person is trouble," Violet said. Silas was building a second room onto the cabin. The loft had served, but it was not ideal, and he had been laying timber when the work at Double Creek allowed it. The summer of 1880 was a good one for the ranch, the herd healthy and the market prices favorable, and August Hollies was in the expansive mood that good seasons produced in him. He gave Silas latitude and resources, and the operation ran well. In the late summer of 1880, 3 things happened that shaped the next period of their lives. The first was that Mortimer Webb asked Violet if she would consider writing a regular column for the Keller's Bend paper, a weekly piece, on any subject she chose, paid at an established rate. She said yes with a speed that surprised herself and then wrote about her garden, the cattle, the quality of Kansas light, the particular civilization being constructed in this valley by particular people, week after week, and found that she never ran out of things worth saying. The second thing was that August Hollies' wife returned. Martha Hollies came back from the East in September, thinner and quieter than August had described her in the years of her absence, and took up residence in the main house again, with a manner that suggested the East had been complicated, and that she was not discussing it further. She was a woman of 50 and considerable self-possession, and Violet liked her from the first meeting, which happened at a small dinner at the main house to which she and Silas had been invited. Martha Hollies spoke to Violet about the column in the Keller's Bend paper with the directness of someone who had read it and had things to say. "The piece about the blizzard last March," Martha said. "That was very fine writing." "Thank you," Violet said. "You've been here how long?" "Since October of '78, Violet said. "So nearly 2 years. You write about this place as though you've known it all your life." "Some places you recognize quickly," Violet said. "It doesn't require years." Martha Hollies looked at her with an assessing expression that was not unkind. "My husband speaks very well of your husband," she said. "I'm glad of it," Violet said. "He works very hard for this ranch." "And for his own," Martha said. "August says the North Parcel is coming along well." "Slowly," Violet said, "but steadily." "That's the better kind of progress," Martha said. The third thing that happened in the summer of 1880 was that a man arrived in Harrow Creek who created, for a period of several weeks, a degree of difficulty. His name was Amos Creel, and he was a distant relative of someone in town whose connection to Harrow Creek was unclear, and whose intentions regarding several pieces of property in the area were not entirely above board. He appeared at August Hollies' ranch on a Tuesday morning, with papers that he claimed gave him some prior interest in a section of land adjacent to the North Creek, the section that bordered Silas and Violet's 40 acres. Silas brought the papers home that evening and spread them on the kitchen table, and he and Violet looked at them together. Silas was not a lawyer, but he was a man who read carefully and had spent years managing the complicated documentation of a cattle operation, and he could see without much difficulty that the papers Amos Creel had presented were old and imprecise in the way that early land grants in Kansas Territory sometimes were. He sent a letter to a solicitor in Keller's Bend named Grantham, who was a careful man with a reputation for honesty. Grantham came out in the second week of August and looked at the documents and then at Silas and Violet's deed, and then at a map he produced from his leather case, and delivered his assessment with the precision of someone who has considered the relevant facts. "Creel's paper is from 1866, Grantham said, before Kansas statehood. issued under a territorial land allocation that was superseded by the State Land Office Act of 1868. It gives him no actionable claim against a deed issued under the state process, which your deed is. His paper is not fraudulent in the technical sense. It may have been valid at the time of issue, but it has no standing under current law. Silas looked at Violet across the table. She looked at Grantham. So he has no claim. No legitimate claim, Grantham said. He may attempt to make noise. Some men do, hoping that the legitimate landowner will prefer to settle quietly rather than deal with the trouble. I would advise you not to settle. We will not be settling, Violet said, before Silas had formulated his response, and Grantham looked at her with an approving expression that she filed away. Amos Creel did make noise for approximately 3 weeks, appearing at the edges of August Hollies' operation and in the general store in Harrow Creek with complaints about the situation. August Hollies told him directly, and without diplomatic softening, that the claim was not valid, and that Creel's continued presence in the vicinity was not welcome. And Silas had a shorter and even more direct conversation with him, outside the general store on a Wednesday afternoon, that Violet did not witness, but that Hank Prout described later with considerable appreciation for Silas's economy of language. Creel departed Harrow Creek in early September, and the land along the North Creek remained what it had always been, theirs. Violet wrote about the experience in her column, not naming names but describing the general phenomenon of land disputes in a growing territory, the legacy of imprecise early documentation, the importance of proper legal process, the way that a piece of ground could represent something much larger than its acreage once people had put themselves into it. Mortimer Webb told her it was the most discussed piece she had written. By the fall of 1880, the cabin had its additional room and a covered porch on the east side where the morning light came in. Violet kept the garden through the summer and put up preserves in August in the way that Ruth had taught her, and the shelf above the fireplace held the biscuit tin and the deed, and a small collection of books and Thomas's first shoe, which was the smallest thing Violet had ever seen worn by a person, and which she had put there after Thomas outgrew it because it seemed important to mark these things. Thomas, at 8 months, was crawling with the focused energy of a person who has somewhere to be, and Violet followed him around the cabin with the tireless attention of a mother who knows exactly what all the corners contain. He was a good-natured child with occasional opinions expressed at volume, and he was his father's son in the way that was visible in the set of his jaw and the steadiness of his regard, but he was his mother's child in the laugh, which was quick and full and given freely. Ruth came to Sunday dinner most weeks, brought in the buggy by her neighbor's boy. She moved more slowly than she had the year before, but her mind was as sharp as it had always been, and her opinions were, if anything, more precisely delivered. She held Thomas on her lap with the particular competence of a woman who has been around children without always being soft about them, and talked to him as though he were a reasonable adult who happened to be temporarily very small. "He'll be a reader," Ruth said one Sunday, watching Thomas attempt to engage with a copy of the Keller's Bend paper. "He's eating it," Violet said. "Reading comes in various forms," Ruth said. The year turned over to 1881 and then moved through its seasons. Thomas took his first steps in March, which Silas witnessed by chance on a Thursday evening when he came home early, and which Violet recorded in the small journal she had started keeping when Thomas was born, not for the column, which was public, but for herself, and for Thomas someday, the private catalog of the life they were building. Spring brought new calves to Double Creek and new growth to Violet's garden, and a change to the north cabin that Silas had been planning through the winter. A proper wood floor, laid in oak planks that came from Keller's Bend, which transformed the feel of the place from temporary to permanent. Violet walked on it the evening it was finished, and the sound was different, solid, a sound that said, "This is a house, not a shelter." "It's real now," she said. "It was real before," Silas said. "More real then." She wrote about the floor in her column, or about what a floor meant, about the way that permanence accumulated in small material decisions, the way a place became a home through the aggregate of chosen things. Mortimer Webb said a woman in Keller's Bend had written to the paper to say it was the piece she had saved from the whole year, which was the kind of feedback that a writer kept. In the summer of 1881, Violet discovered she was expecting again. She told Silas in the same way she had told him the first time, directly on the porch in the evening, and he received it in the same way, with wonder and the quick practical question of her well-being. "I'm well," she said. "Better than the first time, honestly. I know more now." "You know everything," he said. "I know considerably more than you," she agreed. He laughed. Thomas, sitting on the porch between them with a stick he had found somewhere, looked up at the sound of his father's laugh with the expression of a child who finds parental happiness reassuring, and then returned to the stick. The second child was born in January of 1882, and it was a girl, easier than Thomas but louder about the process, with red hair that was entirely inexplicable given that neither Silas nor Violet had it, but which Ruth said could be attributed to a gray tan of Violet's mother, who had been reportedly red-headed and generally remarkable. They named her Clara, not after Clara Briggs from the hotel, or not only, but because it was a good name and Violet had always liked it. Clara Mercer came into the world with an apparent intention to be heard, which she fulfilled consistently from the start. Thomas regarded her with the wariness of a 2-year-old who has previously had all the available attention and was now reassessing the situation, and then with the gradual interest of a child who finds that the new addition is actually quite entertaining when it is not screaming. The cabin was full. The life was full. The 40 acres along the North Creek were a real place now, with a proper house and a garden that produced well in good years and adequately in bad ones, with the creek to the north, and the pastures spreading south and east toward the Double Creek operation. They had 2 horses and a milk cow, and a small population of chickens that Violet managed with more affection than she had expected to develop for poultry. Silas was foreman of Double Creek, and took it seriously in the way he took all things seriously, with the daily application of judgment and attention. August Hollies was aging but was not ready to step back, and he and Silas had developed the working relationship of 2 men who respected each other's knowledge. Martha Hollies had settled back into the life of the ranch with the practical intelligence she brought to everything, and she and Violet had become genuine friends, the kind that did not require constant maintenance but were solid when called upon. Ruth's health declined slowly through 1882, the way that the health of aging people declines, not dramatically, not quickly, but with the steady erosion of time. She walked less and rested more, and her appetite was smaller, though her mind remained completely herself. Violet visited 3 times a week and sometimes more, and Ruth received these visits with her characteristic mix of genuine pleasure and protest that she did not require so much attention. In the autumn of 1882, Ruth called Violet to sit with her one afternoon and told her with complete clarity that she was putting the house and its contents to Violet. She had seen to it legally in Keller's Bend. "It should be yours," Ruth said. "It was your father's family's connection that brought us both here, and I have no other family to leave it to." "You don't have to think about that yet," Violet said. "I think about what is practical," Ruth said. "At my age, thinking about what is practical means thinking about this." Violet held her aunt's hand, those hands that were thin and dry and had been capable for 62 years. "Thank you," she said, "for all of it. You were not an easy child," Ruth said. "I know it." "You were worth the trouble," Ruth said, and that was the most extravagant thing Ruth Hartwell had ever said to her, and Violet knew it. Ruth died in November of 1882, quietly, in her own bed in the house she had occupied for 20 years. Violet was there, and the end was gentle. She sat with her aunt for a while after, in the particular silence of a house that is transitioning, and then she went home to the North Creek cabin and found Silas by the fire with Thomas asleep on the settee beside him and Clara in the crib. And she sat down and let him hold her, and did not say much because she did not need to. He understood what she did not say, which was something she had come to depend on and was still grateful for, because dependence on good things was not weakness but wisdom. They buried Ruth in the Harrow Creek Cemetery on a cold November day, and Preacher Hatch said the right things, and the town came out in the way that small towns come out for people who have been a part of them long enough to matter. August Hollies and Martha were there, and Hank Prout, and Mortimer Webb had driven out from Keller's Bend, which surprised and moved Violet considerably. She wrote a letter to the paper once, Webb told Violet after the burial, standing in the cold with his hat in his hands. About your column, said it was the only thing in the county paper worth the ink. High praise from a woman like that. Violet looked at him. She never told me. She probably thought you had enough people telling you things were good, he said. She seemed like a woman who measured her compliments. She was, Violet said. She was exactly that. The winter of 1882 turning into 1883 was a period of reorganization, and the specific kind of grief that is also tinged with gratitude, grief for the person gone and gratitude for the time given, for the house in town that was now theirs by gift, for the years of knowing Ruth Hartwell that had been a form of education Violet could not have gotten anywhere else. They kept the townhouse and rented it to a young couple who had come to Harrow Creek to set up a millinery business, which Ruth would have found practical and slightly amusing. The income helped with the North Creek operation, and Violet liked the idea of the house being inhabited and useful rather than empty. Thomas was 3 years old in the winter of 1883 and had strong opinions about horses, which he expressed by following Silas to the small barn as often as he could arrange it, and watching the horses with an intensity that Silas said was familiar. He began teaching Thomas the basics of horses the way he had been taught himself, slowly, carefully, with respect for the animal as a creature with its own intelligence. Clara at 1 year was conducting a systematic investigation of the cabin's lower surfaces, which required constant supervision and produced daily discoveries. The spring of 1883 was a good spring, and the summer was dry but manageable, and the Double Creek operation had its best year in recent memory. Silas came home in September with news that August Hollies had made a new proposal, that the agreement about the 40 acres be extended to include another 20 acres to the east, at the same favorable terms, and that Silas's arrangement as foreman be formalized with a written contract that protected both parties. They sat at the kitchen table that evening with the children asleep, and the lamp between them and Silas spread the proposed terms on the table. Violet read them with the attention she brought to things that mattered. He's giving us 60 acres, she said, with conditions, but fair conditions. What do you think? I think August Hollies is a man who keeps good faith, Silas said. I think this is a good deal and we should take it. Then we take it, she said. He looked at her across the table. You don't want to think on it longer. I've thought on it, she said. I'm decisive when I know the answer. I know it, he said. It's one of the things I love most about you. She looked at him in the lamp light. He had said I love you in many forms across the years they had been together. In the way he handled the things she cared about, and in the way he listened, and in the way he had kept every letter she ever wrote in a tin beneath his bunk, because he could not bring himself to do anything less. But he said it in words too now because she had asked him to, and he had learned, and he was not a man who stopped trying once he had started. One of them, she said. There is a long list, he said. I'll write it down if you like. Please do, she said. I'll put it in the tin. He laughed, and the lamp between them made the cabin warm and particular, and outside the 60 acres of the North Creek spread out toward the dark that was not empty but full of the things they had planted in it. In 1884, Thomas started school in Harrow Creek, which required a daily trip to town and back, and which he regarded with the seriousness he brought to things that were clearly important. The school had been properly established 2 years prior, with a teacher named Miss Ellsworth who was young and energetic, and who Violet had found immediately excellent. Thomas came home in the afternoons full of information that he delivered to Clara with the authority of an older sibling, and Clara received it with the skepticism of a 2-year-old who has observed that older siblings are not always right. Violet's column continued in the Keller's Bend paper and had grown to be a substantial feature of it. Mortimer Webb told her that it was regularly the most read thing in the paper, which produced the specific satisfaction of a writer who wants to be read rather than merely published. She wrote about all of it: the land and the cattle and the children and the changing of the seasons, the history of the place she had come to know, the people who made up Harrow Creek and the surrounding territory. She wrote about the injustices she observed, the way that certain families, particularly those of Mexican descent who had been on this land before many of the Anglo settlers, were treated with a casual dismissiveness that she found both wrong and short-sighted. She wrote about it plainly, because she had learned from Ruth that the honest thing was usually the useful thing. Mortimer Webb printed everything she wrote, including the pieces that generated complaint letters. "You write what you see," he told her on one of his visits. "That's the job. Some of the readers don't agree," she said. "Some of the readers don't have to," he said. "The paper doesn't exist to confirm what people already think." She liked Mortimer Webb. She liked that he was serious about what he did. She wrote him a letter once, not for publication, thanking him for the space he had given her work, and he wrote back in the careful handwriting of a man who took correspondence seriously, saying that the thanks were mutual. She put his letter in the desk drawer and then, on an impulse she found privately amusing, showed it to Silas. "Should I be jealous of the editor?" he asked. "He's 50 years old and completely absorbed in his newspaper," she said. "That's not an answer." "No," she said, "you should not be jealous. You are the person I have been writing to for 7 years now, and I have no intention of stopping." "Good," he said. "The tin is getting full." She looked at the tin on the shelf. The letters inside it now were a mixture: her early letters from before their marriage, and the letter she had written him in December of their first year, and several others she had written since, because she had not stopped writing to him, not even after they were in the same house, because there were things that were easier on paper, and she had made her peace with that about herself. He had kept all of them. The tin was slightly battered now. It had been moved and handled and had accumulated the marks of years. She thought it was better for that. The summer of 1885 brought Thomas home from school for the long break a different person in the way that 5-year-olds become 6 and then 7, which is to say visibly. He could read well now, better than some of his classmates, which Violet attributed not entirely to Miss Ellsworth, but to the sustained presence of books in the North Creek cabin, and to the fact that his mother could be found reading at nearly any time of day. He had also developed an interest in the cattle operation that went beyond following his father around, and had graduated to actual small tasks, which Silas allowed and supervised with the patience of a man who remembers being taught. Clara at 3 was a person of considerable energy and opinions, with the red hair that had settled into something bright and permanent, and a laugh that filled whatever room she was in. She had inherited from somewhere, nobody was entirely certain where, a tendency to negotiate, which Violet found alternately exhausting and impressive. In the fall of 1885, Violet learned she was expecting for the 3rd time. She was 29 years old, and the news arrived with the warmth of something familiar, something known. She told Silas on the porch again, because it had become their place for the important things, the east-facing porch with the morning light that was evening light now in October. "Another one," he said. "Another one," she confirmed. He put his arm around her in the way he had, which she had come to know so well that she could feel the shape of it before it arrived. "Are you glad?" he asked. "I am," she said. "Are you?" "Completely." Thomas and Clara received the news with varying degrees of engagement. Thomas with the thoughtful acceptance of a child who processes things internally. Clara with immediate and extensive commentary about what the new baby would be like, which she delivered as though her preferences on the subject were determinative. The third child was born in April of 1886, a boy, and they named him James, after Silas's father who had died the winter before in Texas. Silas had gone south for a week when his father passed, and Violet had managed the children and the household and the ranch with the competence of a woman who had been doing this for years, and had written him 2 letters for those 2 weeks, because some distances require paper even when you are no longer far from each other. James was a placid child in the way that third children sometimes are, accustomed from the beginning to noise and the presence of older siblings, unbothered by things that had alarmed Thomas and been negotiated by Clara. He watched the world around him with wide, interested eyes and grew steadily through the spring and summer of his birth year into a round, cheerful presence that everyone at Double Creek found irresistible. August hollies held James when Violet brought the children out to the ranch on a Sunday visit in July, and looked at him with the expression of a man thinking about what he did not have. His own children, he had 2 daughters who lived in the East with their husbands, were grown and gone, and Martha had made peace with a different shape of family than she had imagined. But August held James with a gentleness that Violet had not seen in him before and then handed him back with a gruffness that was clearly covering something. "Good boy," he said, meaning James. "Strong." "He is," Silas said. "You've built something out here," August said, gesturing without specifics, but Violet understood the gesture to mean the children and the land and the life, all of it. "We have," Silas said, and the "we" was entirely natural and entirely intended. The years that followed were years of accumulation. Not dramatic accumulation, not the accumulation of novels that require catastrophe to be interesting, but the real accumulation of a life built carefully and maintained with attention. The 60 acres along the North Creek became a working homestead of real substance. Silas negotiated with August for the right to run a small herd of their own on the adjacent range during the years that the Double Creek operation did not need it at full capacity, and by 1888 they had 30 head of their own cattle and a credible claim to being ranchers in their own right. Violet's column had made her a modest reputation across 3 or 4 counties by this point, and she had been approached by a larger paper in Wichita about writing occasional pieces for a wider audience, which she accepted with Mortimer Webb's blessing, because he was not a man who would hold a good opportunity back from a writer he respected. Thomas, who was 8 years old in 1888, had developed into a serious-minded boy with his father's capacity for sustained attention and his mother's capacity for observation. He read everything he could find and asked questions that required real answers, and Violet and Silas both took the questions seriously, which Thomas clearly appreciated. Clara, at 6, was conducting her life with the organizational energy of a small general, directing games and projects and the general activity of the North Creek cabin, with a confidence that Silas said was going to be either brilliant or catastrophic, depending on circumstances. James, at 2, was beginning to walk and talk, and had recently discovered that the word no was available to him, which he was using extensively. In 1889, Kansas was deep in the process of becoming settled. The frontier character of it was shifting, the raw edge moving further west, and Harrow Creek was now clearly a real town with real institutions and a future. Violet wrote about the change, because she had been there long enough to observe it, and what she wrote was not sentimental about the passing of the old way because the old way had been genuinely hard, but neither was it dismissive of what was being lost, the openness, the particular quality of a land still in the process of naming itself. She wrote, in one of the pieces the Wichita paper ran, about the biscuit tin. Not naming it as such, not being obvious about it, but writing about the keeping of things, the way that certain objects become containers for something larger than their material existence, the way that a piece of paper can hold years. She wrote about what it meant to be the kind of person who kept things rather than discarding them, who held on to evidence of feeling in a physical form, who chose to preserve rather than to let the ordinary erosion of time take everything. Silas read it when the paper arrived from Wichita on the Tuesday stage. He read it at the kitchen table with the coffee and the morning sounds of the children moving around the house, and when he finished, he folded the paper and looked at her. "That's about the tin," he said. "It's about the general principle of the tin," she said. "It's about the tin specifically." "It's about many tins," she said, "of which ours is an example." He looked at her with the look she had known for 11 years now, the one that was warm and direct and had not changed in its essential quality since the first time she was on the receiving end of it. "Good," he said. She sat down across from him. "It is good," she agreed. He reached across the table and touched her hand, and the morning went on around them, James making noise in the other room, Clara's voice giving directions to someone, Thomas's feet on the floor above in the loft where he had taken to doing his reading, the cattle making their early morning sounds in the distance, the creek still there, always there, moving through the cottonwoods. That evening she found a letter on her pillow, Silas's handwriting, which she knew now from the labels on feed sacks and the ranch accounts and the occasional note left for her, but which she had never seen in a letter to her before. She sat down on the edge of the bed and opened it. It was 2 pages, both sides, and it said the things he had been keeping for 11 years. Not dramatically, he was not a dramatic man, but completely. It said that she was the thing he had built his life toward, that every piece of the North Creek property and the cattle and the foreman work had been meaningful specifically, because she was the reason for meaning. It said that Thomas and Clara and James were the evidence of something that could not have been manufactured by any act of will alone, but had required the particular combination of 2 specific people, and that he was grateful every day for the particular combination they were. It said that he had kept her letters because he could not do otherwise, that they were the most important documents in his possession and would remain so, but that what he had not previously said in writing was that she herself was the most important thing, not the letters but the person who wrote them. That Violet Ford, who had become Violet Mercer, who was exactly and entirely herself in both names, was the fact of his life and the organizing principle of everything he valued. He had signed it simply, Silas. She sat with the letter for a long time. Then she got up and found him where he was checking on the horses in the small barn, because that was often where he ended up in the evenings, and she went in and he turned from the horse he had been brushing and looked at her in the lantern light. She held up the letter. 11 years, she said. You told me to say things out loud, he said, or in writing you were not specific. Silas, Violet. She crossed the barn and stood in front of him and looked at him in the lantern light that was the same quality as lamplight, warm and partial and generous. He was 37 years old and lean and dark-haired and exactly himself, the man who had kept every letter she ever wrote, who had built her a house with a door that faced east, who had named their son for her father, who had kept faith with things in the dark without any promise of return. She put her hand on his chest over his heart. I love you, she said. I have loved you since before I knew I was doing it, and I will be loving you long after either of us has any idea what to do with that information. He put his hand over hers. Good, he said, because I intend to give you a great deal of time to work out what to do with it. She laughed, and then he pulled her close and held her in the barn with the horses calm around them and the lantern throwing warm shadows, and she thought about all the ways a life added up in miles traveled and letters written and words said and words not said and then finally said, in children named and rooms built and floors laid and tin can sitting on shelves in the firelight. She thought it added up to exactly this. The years continued, as years do, turning through their seasons with the particular rhythm of a life that knows what it is. Thomas grew into a young man with his father's work ethic and his mother's words. He started writing for the Harrow Creek Gazette that opened in 1891, small pieces at first and then larger ones. And Violet read everything he wrote with the pride of a mother who also knows enough to offer genuine criticism. Clara grew into a young woman of formidable energy and practical intelligence. And at 17, she had organized the women of the area into a collective that pooled resources for the purchase of a proper schoolroom addition, which the town had been needing for 3 years. James grew steadily into his own person, quieter than either sibling and more given to the physical work of the ranch, which suited him, and which Silas taught him with the patience he brought to all important teaching. By 1892, the North Creek homestead was 60 acres of good working land with a house of 5 rooms, and a covered porch that wrapped around 3 sides, and a barn that was proper, and a garden that Violet had refined over 15 years into something genuinely productive. The cattle numbered 50 head under their own brand. The Double Creek Agreement had evolved over the years, and August Hollies at 70 years old had begun to transfer more of the operation formally to Silas, in recognition that the future of the ranch required a younger man's management, and that Silas Mercer was the man who had earned it. The arrangement was formal by 1893. Silas held a significant stake in the Double Creek operation in addition to the North Creek homestead, a partner in the business in a real and documented sense. It was not what either of them had imagined exactly, because imagination is always less specific than what actually happens, but it was something that made the work of 15 years visible in material form, which was satisfying. Ruth's house in town continued to house tenants, and the income from it had funded various improvements over the years, including the extension of the cabin and some of the early cattle purchases. Violet thought about Ruth when she managed these arrangements, thought about what Ruth would have said about various decisions, and found that Ruth's voice was easy to summon, clear and precise and honest, the voice of a woman who had told the truth as a matter of principle. In the spring of 1895, Thomas married a young woman from Keller's Bend named Josephine, who was 20 years old and taught music in the school there, and who Violet liked immediately for the same reason. She liked competent people who knew what they were doing and were not precious about it. They married in the Harrow Creek church where Violet and Silas had married 16 years before, and Violet stood in that church and looked at her son at the front of it and felt the full weight and warmth of how much time had passed and how well it had been used. Clara, at 13 in 1895, had opinions about the wedding that she shared freely. James, at 9, had fewer opinions but ate a great deal of the wedding food, which was noted. On the evening of Thomas's wedding, Violet and Silas sat on the porch of the North Creek house in the May night, and she thought about the evening in the Hartwell kitchen in 1879 when he had asked her to marry him. "Do you remember what I said?" she asked. "You said obviously yes," he said. "I said obviously yes because I had written you 17 letters. I think the current count is considerably higher." He looked at the spring night around them, the creek sound, the cattle in the pasture, the lights of Harrow Creek visible in the distance where they had not been visible when they first came here because the town had grown. "How many?" he said. "I've stopped counting," she said. "Dozens. The tin is actually full, Silas. We need a second one." He turned to look at her with a smile that was still, after 16 years, the complete version, nothing held back. "I'll find one," he said. "Make sure it's a good one," she said. "It has to last." He took her hand in the way he always did, certain, warm, completely present. The night around them was full of the sounds of the life they had built, and the porch of the east-facing house held them both in the May dark, and Violet thought that she had been right about this place, about this man, from the beginning. She had known it that first summer in Harrow Creek, in some form that she had not had language for, and she had tried to say it in 17 letters before she knew what she was saying, and he had kept every one. She leaned against him and looked out at the creek pastures going silver in the moonlight, and she thought that this was what all of it had been building toward, not the land or the cattle or the column or even the children, though all of those were part of it. It was this, The particular quality of sitting on a porch in the May dark with the person you had chosen and who had chosen you back, slowly and with great care, and knowing that you would be doing this tomorrow, and the year after and every year that remained to you. She had his letter on the shelf in the bedroom, the 2-page letter he had left on her pillow in 1889, and she knew it by heart now the way he had known her letters by heart long before she knew he was reading them. She thought that was something, the reciprocity of it, the way that keeping faith with a thing eventually brings the thing to you. The biscuit tin was on the shelf above the fireplace where it had been since their first winter on the North Creek, and the letters inside it were soft from years of handling and carrying, and there were so many of them now that the tin could not properly close. She thought she should have said something to Silas about that sooner, but she also thought there was something right about a container that could not hold everything it had been asked to hold about a life that exceeded the shape you had made for it. He would find another tin. She knew him well enough to know he would find the right one, that he would put the same care into the selection of a tin that he put into everything he kept. She knew him, after all these years, as thoroughly as she knew the east-facing porch, and the sound of the creek, and the particular quality of winter light on the Kansas pastures. She knew him as well as she knew herself, which was the best thing she could say about anyone. The spring night moved around them and the creek ran on below the cottonwoods, and Violet Ford, who had been Violet Mercer for 16 years, and who would be Violet Mercer for all the years that remained, held her husband's hand in the dark and was exactly where she had always been heading without quite knowing it, across all the miles and letters and seasons that had brought her here. And here was enough. Here was, in fact, everything.